So welcome to what in the conference business we call the graveyard slot. This is the panel right after lunch when our blood flow flows not in the direction of the brain. But I assure you we are armed with the best weapon to get people's attention, and this is, of course, Elon Musk. And Elon also decided to help us this morning, and he blew up one of his starships, as you probably seen on the news. So everybody is interested in Elon. So to get people's attention, I just like to start our conversation with a show of hands. How many of you are on Twitter? Okay, 95% market share. That's fine. How many of you have a blue check? Not anymore. Okay, that was a trick question, David, I know. Blue check as of yesterday. Okay, how many of you think you're going to pay Elon $7.99 to get the blue check? Oh, you met. Okay. All right. So, so welcome to the Elon Musk panel. All the participants are here, and you are more than welcome to tweet throughout this panel. So although this annual conference deals with antitrust, competition, and concentration, ever since the first conference we started in 2017, we included panels about the news media. And I was looking at the title of the panel that we had here exactly 6 years ago in the conference in April 2000, the inaugural in 2017. It was Information in the Age of Concentration. Can media hold powerful actors to account in the age of huge digital platforms and business? And I think this question is relevant of course, today, but looking back to what has changed in the last 6 years, I would say that mostly it is the way that the news media and also academia, of course, covers big tech and monopolies in general. The sentiment has changed markedly. Less than a decade ago, there were only, believe it or not, handful of investigative journalists that were seriously scrutinizing big tech. Now, it's probably one of the most covered issue in the media. There was exponential growth in this particular beat. But the power and influence of big tech companies, and especially social networks, on news, on journalists, on politics, and public discourse has definitely grown dramatically and is growing all the time. And indeed, if you're following testimony of some whistleblowers, the internal documents from Francis Haugen, the whistleblower of Facebook, showed that European political parties told Facebook repeatedly that they were being forced to take more extreme positions in their platforms and their rhetorics because of the platform's algorithm tweak. So since 2020, 2021, there has been many initiatives in the US and, of course, in Europe to rein in the power of big tech and regulate social networks. But one issue is not yet part of that discussion, and I think that it became more salient only recently, and this is the question of the ownership of social networks. So many people agree on some regulation or a very aggressive regulation, depending where you come from, of digital platforms, but the question is, should ownership be included in this conversation, and this is where we're going to start our discussion today with experts in the panel. So I want to quickly first introduce our esteemed panelists, not in the order of their sitting, but Roslyn Clayton is an economist from Aalborg University of Copenhagen, and she works with policymakers on communication and technology policy. Dina Srinivasan is a researcher, a lawyer, an entrepreneur, and a fellow with the Thurman Element Project at Yale University. And many people in this room are aware that Dina's research provided the foundation of the government enforcement antitrust laws and lawsuit against Facebook and Google. Anat Admati is a professor of finance and economics at Stanford and the faculty director of the Corporations and Society Initiative. She's the author of Banker's New Clothes that she wrote 10 years ago, and we might go back to that theme of this book, although it's on finance, and see how it's relevant to today's discussion. Cory Doctorow is a science fiction author, an activist, and a journalist. He's the author of many books, most recently Red Team Blues, a science fiction crime thriller, and Choke Point Capitalism, nonfiction about monopoly and creative labor markets. And last but not least, of course, is the old-timer of this conference, Matt Stoller. He's the director of research at the American Economic Liberties Project and the author of Goliath, the 100 Years' War between monopoly power and democracy. So we're going to start off with 2 or 3 questions that I'm going to throw in generally to the panel and then to each specific panelist, and then it's just going to be a lively discussion. So the first question to the panel is very simple and straightforward. Do we need to be worried now that Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Sergey Brin, Larry Page have total control, sometimes with special voting rights, on the 3 largest media platforms in the world? Roslyn,
yes.
Please. Go ahead.
Yes, I say yes.
Yes.
We're just going down the
Okay.
panel.
All right. So please elaborate. Why?
Well, I'm gonna put it up on a slide. You know, I don't have my answer ready. I'm gonna go to Cory.
Okay, Cory, shoot.
I mean, I think that there's a kind of split among people who are worried about tech. And there are some people who are worried that the tech barons we have are the wrong tech barons. The problem with Mark Zuckerberg is that he's the wrong person to be the social media czar for life of 3 billion people. And then there are other people who say that that job shouldn't exist, that we need to abolish Mark Zuckerberg and everyone like him. And I fall in that second camp. We saw an incredible slide this morning about the percentage of enforcement action that involves enforcing consent decrees, which is less than 1%. I think that asking these guys to behave themselves and then handing them just effectively unlimited amounts of power is inadequate. I mean, one of the realpolitiks of enforcement is that the larger your adversary is, the harder it is to enforce against them. I was struck this morning when we heard enforcers speaking that among the evils that they cataloged of monopoly, consumer harms, and so on, we didn't hear much about the fact that when a sector dwindles to just a few firms, that they can resolve the collective action problem of mobilizing their capital to securing parochial advantage in law and policy, right? America doesn't have a privacy law. It doesn't have a privacy law because anytime someone tries it, billions of dollars are mobilized against it by 3 or 4 people who all know each other and are godparents to each other's children and walked each other down the aisle and are executors of each other's estates and never have to explicitly collude to emerge a consensus about whether or not America should have a privacy law. If there were 150 firms, irrespective of the other advantages or disadvantages, they wouldn't even be able to agree on how to cater their annual meeting, much less whether we should have a privacy law.
All right, thank you. Anat?
I think just thinking about the ownership of the media is kind of proxy for maybe other things that we might be worried about. So what are we really worried about? What I'm worried about by now is just the discourse, the political discourse, and exactly how it takes place, and the place and the power of truth in that world. And the question is, do the people who control media care about that at all? And if so, it's a very tricky concept. So, legacy media, as the description of the panel says, was also controlled by magnates you know, Murdoch was in the news recently, and he controls, and Catherine Graham controlled the Washington Post, and now it's Jeff Bezos who controls the Washington Post. So it's a question of what way you said, is it the wrong person? And I think a little bit it is about whether it's the wrong person, because Elon Musk is a particular character that is more likely than others to use his power in ways that would fight over Substack and things of that sort. And so we see more of this conduct that is illegal. Now, obviously, I don't want concentration of power of any sort, but the question is then, what do we do about it in the world with these economies of scale and all this stuff? So I am concerned with the bigger problem of political discourse. I read recently a book that I actually have here with me called Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is a book about the media written in the 80s. And in that book, the author is concerned about discourse becoming too much of an entertainment and people's attention spans to any kind of discussion waning. And this was in the 80s, in the age of television increasing, and far off from the world of cable news, which evolved a little bit later than that. And he was worried about Huxley's Brave New World, not as much as Orwell, Ministry of Truth, that we willingly will just lose the plot and get too much into sound bites and entertainment. So I'm worried about political discourse in the age of overwhelming amount of information.
Thank you.
Including
Matt?
nonsense.
So should we be worried that Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Page, Sergey Brin are in control of the tech barons, essentially, is the question. Okay, so some of you probably heard, I've said this before, that it's a quote from de Tocqueville, who said that there is scarcely a hamlet in America that does not have its own newspaper. This was in the 1830s, I guess. Newspapers in America are older than the nation. And I think that that's the way that I think about the problem. So one thing that happened today, aside from the blue check, is that BuzzFeed announced that it's shutting down. And BuzzFeed is not a local newspaper. It's not a paper that, there's a traditional argument, the news media didn't adapt to the internet. BuzzFeed was born native to the internet, had very innovative CEO, tried a lot of different business models and couldn't make it work. And that's because of monopolization and the specific regulatory schema that we've chosen for these tech platforms. There's a lot of ways to go into that, but I think we've seen just a radical centralization of media power that we've never seen. We are going into a new experiment of an America without newspapers. So if someone had asked, if someone had said Donald Trump is going to shut down 2,000 newspapers and fire 30,000, 40,000 journalists, I think people would have been outraged, just as if Joe Biden said it. But because Google did it, through monopolization or through certain business practices, call it privacy or, but essentially centralizing advertising revenue, it becomes this kind of narrow technocratic issue instead of a core democracy question. So when I think about the question, should we be worried that these people are running these centralized institutions, I don't think that the personalities are that important, but I do think that the centralized nature of these institutions has really launched us into kind of this new period. So just to give you a quick, this was a couple years ago, so it's probably worse today, but 2,000 out of 3,000 American counties have no daily newspaper at this point. Never had anything like that. And I guess the last thing I'll say is it leads to a series of, I think, unless we can change the frame, the way that we think about justice and market power, we're going to go down a path where a substantial number of well-meaning people who see an increasingly a population that doesn't know itself, because there are no newspapers to form a public. The instinct is to go for things like mass content moderation, right? disinformation, and you saw, it didn't come up, it doesn't come up in liberal circles, but you've seen this with reporting from the Twitter files, which I think a lot of people disrespect, but there was important information there about networks of nonprofit institutions, government institutions, and big tech firms that are trying to shape narratives, that are trying to engage in forms of social control because they see a centralized society that's kind of tearing itself apart, and they're trying to purpose the tools that exist to do what they think is to save it. But it is that very centralization that I think is both un-American, outside of our traditions, a radical experiment, and I think a fundamental problem. So that's how I think about the issue. There's a lot of policies that we can talk about that where we're attempting to address this problem, but fundamentally, there are fewer and fewer and fewer people who have the ability to finance speech.
Dina?
Thanks. Can you guys hear me? How do we turn this on? Oh.
I think you're good.
Is it good? Okay, great. I was thinking about sort of this question, and maybe I'll just make a few points that are very high level and obvious, but that I nonetheless think are the most important. The first is that it's really hard to imagine and grasp how large these platforms are when we think about them from a power perspective. So if we're thinking about old magnets versus new magnets, and Bezos owning the Washington Post, I mean, we're talking about Google being able to reach 4.3 billion people just like that. We're talking about Facebook being able to reach 3 billion people. I mean, if you think about that, Twitter, a couple 100 million, but if you think about that from a power perspective, we're probably all familiar with like an Amber Alert, but can you imagine one human, one person being in control of being able to send an alert or a piece of information to billions of people around the world at the same time? And I think that that is one point that really distinguishes the power of old media versus the power of new media. I live in the Bay Area, and there is very little respect for institutional media that we would respect, like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, because the sentiment is they just don't have any power, and so they're irrelevant. Another point that I would make is that it's also just incredible how dangerous really these platforms can be because of how fast information can spread. So just in the last weeks, we saw how a little piece of information spreading on Twitter could take down a top 20 US bank just like that within hours. Or play a very large role in that. And I think that, you know, we haven't seen all of the different ways that power can be expressed with these platforms, but this is just a really important issue and question for us to think about and to predict. No regulation is, we can, I'm sure, debate whether we need regulation, what types of regulation, but the fact that there's no oversight in the face of that types of power, I think is fascinating and concerning. The last point that I would make is that I think that these are substantive concerns from a national security perspective. So the markets get a little bit complicated if you dive into the weeds, but basically all of these social media platforms make money by selling online ads and auctions. And in those auctions, user data is exposed to anyone in the auction with a seat to bid. So you could, for example, have foreign actors that are sitting in these US auctions supposedly to bid, that don't actually bid, but that are just collecting user data that they can then use against US interests. And so it's just also a lot of power that has massive implications to US national security.
Okay, so Anat already brought up the Murdoch question, and Matt talked about Tocqueville, and I wonder. So Tocqueville was enamored with the role of the newspapers to democracy, and he said only a newspaper can drop one thought to 1,000 minds. To believe that they preserve democracy is to underestimate them. They maintain civilization. And the question I have is, what would Tocqueville said if we presented him with the way that Rupert Murdoch runs a newspaper? So Rupert Murdoch agreed to pay $787 million yesterday to Dominion. It's probably one of the biggest payments of someone ever paid by someone that just wants to avoid testifying in an open a court. But even without him testifying, the documents that court forced him to reveal left no doubt that Fox lied knowingly and perhaps helped foment the January 6th events because it didn't want there to anger its audience. It was part of the business model, actually. They were forced by the business model of Fox. Now, Fox News is not run by an algorithm, but, and this is the question to the panel, the editorial decision there in those important days after the 2020 elections were not very different than those of social network algorithm. Whatever maximizes addiction will be promoted aggressively. So here is the question, another way of phrasing the question that I opened with here. What's the difference between ownership of social networks that are pretty powerful and ownership of a network like Fox that is part of a global empire of a man that his nickname was and still is the man who owns the news. Perhaps, Roslyn, you want to start? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so thank you. I'm going to go into this in my presentation, but for me, there's some huge challenge with the regulatory asymmetry. If you're going to be in a broadcast media, you will have, Federal Communications Commission oversight. But that's not the same if you're an internet media. You will not have that oversight at all. So, the example I give, we talked about, to me it seems like a double standard. Elon Musk can buy Twitter. There's no sort of gatekeeper for that. He can just buy it. But if you're a guy like Sue Kim who wants to buy 60 TV stations and revamp their business model to compete with big tech and advertising, you have to go to the FCC to get permissions to transfer the license. So now you have the longest ever hearing at the FCC for transfer of a broadcast license. And instead of taking the vote, the FCC has sent it to the administrative law court, administrative law judge at the FCC. Now, you could say you want like or dislike the merger, but take the vote. So the point of sending it to the ALJ is so the FCC doesn't have to take the decision. And the sort of scuttlebutt of all this is that Sue Kim is not the right Democrat donor, that Nancy Pelosi wants to have Byron Allen instead of him, even though Sue Kim, a Korean American, would be make this the largest minority-owned, woman-led media company in the country. It would seem to support the Democrat Party goals, that President Biden came to office on. So, for me, the point of this is that companies exploit the regulations that were created to protect the public interest, to protect us, the people. They're exploited through the merger process. They're exploited by wealthy people, donors. They're exploited by big tech for their benefit, not for our benefit.
Cory?
Yeah. So I want to slightly object to the way you framed the question, because you talked about addictive media, and I think that it is a huge mistake to take these guys at their words when they tell us that they're evil sorcerers who hacked our dopamine loops, when there's a much more parsimonious explanation, namely that they have a monopoly and they get to decide what we see, and not that they figured out how to bypass our critical faculties. Mesmer lied when he said he could do it. Rasputin lied when he said he could do it. The MK Ultra lied when they said they could do it. Pickup artists lie when they said they can do it. I don't think we should believe Mark Zuckerberg when he says he can do it, and that's why you should pay him a giant premium for his ads. I think that if you want to contrast what's going on with Fox and the big platforms, I think the way to look at it is how they shift the distributional outcomes of the money in the system. So Fox, it's not a broadcaster, right? Fox is a cable operator. That's the most important thing about Fox, because the cable companies divided up America like the Pope dividing up the New World. And that means that Fox negotiates with every cable company, of which there are only a few, for a carriage fee. Fox's carriage fee is like 10x what anyone else's carriage fee is, And it's not because it's popular, it's because it's popular among a segment of extremely vocal people who will destroy the cable operators' customer support lines if they ever drop Fox in the lineup. It goes ESPN, Fox. We all support Fox. That's why Fox has got all those crappy ads, because they don't make any money from ads. They make the money from us paying for our cable in a monopolized cable environment. Now contrast that with tech, right? There's a story that the problem with Facebook and its relationship to the media is that people talk about the news on Facebook and they link to it and so on. If you're not allowed to link to the news and talk about the news, it's not the news, it's a secret, right? There's not a problem with people talking about the news. And that's not what Fox is, or what Facebook is stealing from the news. What's Facebook and the rest of the tech companies stealing from the news? Well, they get 51% of every ad dollar, right? Compared to 10 to 12%, which is the historic level. They get 30% of every subscriber dollar because the App Store tax, and we've made it a felony to reverse engineer an iPhone and add another App Store to it, which means that what would normally be a 2% processing fee is now a 30% processing fee. If you have a bunch of followers on Facebook as a media company, followers that you got because Facebook, they're sort of fishers of men, right? You post some stuff to your Facebook wall as a media company, and they go out there and they dangle it in front of other people. They say, I know that you signed up for Facebook to hear from the people that you value, and you even articulated that social network for us in a very explicit way, but we're not going to show you what the people you like have to say. We're going to cram stuff from media companies in your eyeballs in the hopes that you will subscribe to some of them. And when the media company transitions to a Facebook-first strategy, they turn to the media company and say, we're not going to show your updates to the people who explicitly subscribe to you unless you paid a boost. So this is another form of extraction from the press, right? It's Dingeld. So you have a 50% app tax, a 30% subscriber tax, you've got Dingeld being extracted, and all of this combined means that Facebook can do to the media companies what Fox does to the cable operators, which is appropriate a share of the income due to a combination of law and technology that is not its by rights and can therefore call the tune. And I think that this is why, when we talk about antitrust being a technical matter, it really matters what the underlying mechanisms are by which this extraction happens. And it's why it matters that we be precise when we talk about how Facebook and other firms influence us, not by hacking our dopamine loops. But if Google told you that the Brooklyn Bridge was 320 feet long, and it was really 328 feet long, you would probably never discover the difference unless you took a tape measure out. That's not mind control, right? That's just having control of the main means by which we get information.
Anat?
So I actually, you might say there's a disconnect between the previous, I'll get to this particular question, the previous panels and then this one, but just as being kind of one of fewer than the previous panels, economists on this panel, I want to make a little bit of a connection because, the way the morning panels were and the way we would probably proceed in this conference, is to talk about merger guidelines and the Sherman Act Title XYZ. And somehow it was presumed in the first panel that this was all about efficiency. So I kind of was curious and went back to the Sherman Act, and actually, as some of you know in this room, had nothing to do with efficiency, but it was about, it didn't mention it at all, and neither did the 1950 amendment of it. When did efficiency come into the game? This is about the little battles we saw about economists versus other people, and what is good economics in this context, and whether we need more big data or what do we need to discuss power. But it was the word that appears 7 times there is conspire or conspiracy. That's what it was about. So it was really about power and the use of power more than it was about economic efficiency, which somehow it transformed itself into, starting, 68 and especially 96, where you can find the word efficiency splashed over the entire discussion of merger guidelines. So just to sort of connect a little bit of the dot. In other words, when we talk about practices and competition, we really should go back to the original titles and see what they were about. And they were about the use of power. And in this case, because we're talking about media, it's the use of power over the narratives. And the difference between legacy media and other media, as was mentioned, is the some accountability for the content, where the content is produced by legacy media, but is not produced and there's no liability for it in the social media world. And so they just can say, I'm just sharing, I'm just curating, I'm just doing this and that, I'm not producing any content, therefore don't come back to me. And so there couldn't be any kind of libel suit against Zuckerberg because he doesn't ever produce it. But does that mean that it's not a problem? Well, it's a huge problem that they have the power, and it manifests itself in various practices. So I think our media environment got corrupted and contaminated by a lot of this way in which power is exercised in this domain, and we lost, and democracy has been suffering as a result of that.
So everybody, almost everybody here in the panel agrees that the problem is concentration of power, and when you get media into that, that exacerbates. So Matt, you spent many years on the Hill in the Senate, and who has, in the eyes of politicians and policymakers today, more concentrated power to shape the agenda, how we think, what we think, how politicians give incentives to people? Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, or Rupert Murdoch?
I mean, I don't know that that's an answerable question. It sort of depends who you're talking about. I mean, these are just political impressions. I think they all have different forms of influence. They all have different goals, some of which are complementary, some of which are not. Is there something? Do you have another way of phrasing that question?
Yeah, let's go back to my
really have an
original
answer.
question. Okay, where some people said they are worried with a concentration of power in the hands of digital platforms in the hands of only a few players. And the question is, how do you differentiate between the Murdoch phenomena or the...
Okay, so I'll just try to distinguish between, I think Cory talked about you got to look at how these companies make money, which is, I think, a core element of it. So you started by asking who pays for Twitter, right? And I raised my hand, okay, and most of you have better taste than I do. So you didn't. Man, that was a pretty good joke, but you guys didn't. All right. Yeah. Thank you, Randy. I appreciate that. I'm just going to talk only to you now.
I don't know.
All right. Stop. Fine. So I pay for Twitter. And the reason I pay for Twitter is because I think of it as a communication service. And I like to pay directly for communication services. I pay for my mobile phone. I pay for my ISP because I believe that is the most ethical way to have a communication service. It's really weird that we pay for our communication services with advertising now, that we transitioned to that in sort of the 2000s. It's a weird way to do communications. So we have been paying for our media with advertising for hundreds of years, and we all recognize it's a conflict of interest, right? I mean, the advertiser is not supposed to have influence over the newsroom. The advertiser always has influence over the newsroom, but there are debates. There are supposed to be firewalls. There are ethical arguments, and most importantly, there is diversity and competition. So if one newspaper won't say something, maybe another one will, right? So that's the point of these of having a diversity of media is to overcome this ethical problem, which is well understood. Now, we have a similar ethical problem when you finance communication networks with advertising. When the people who are paying or who are consuming the service are the product, we also pay directly. I mean, I know you've said we're not just the product, and we also pay money. But there is something conflicted, like Verizon or T-Mobile. They're just trying to charge you a little bit more with some ticky-tack administrative fee. They're not trying to keep you on the phone, right? They're not trying to get you to have certain kinds of conversation. They're not trying to put a third party in between you and the person you're talking to get you to do something. They're not selling a manipulation, the ability to manipulate you to some third party. But that is what advertising is. And so we've decided to finance our communications infrastructure with advertising that has a bunch of consequences that I think are all broadly negative. But that's the way that I would distinguish between something like a Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, which are all terrible, and are bad because of the collapse of diversity of media systems since the 1980s. And a communication network like Google or series of communications like Google or Facebook or Twitter, they're structured differently, and so the same conflicts of interest manifest differently when you use them.
All right, thank you. Dina.
What are we talking about again?
Media, I think.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Murdoch mask.
The difference between
right.
the Murdochs and the owners of the platforms. How do they differ? If we're worried about platforms, should we be worried about players like Murdoch, or Matt puts in the basket of Murdoch also CNN, MSNBC?
So I'll repeat a few of the things that I said before. One, I think, is just reach, right? So at the end of the day, a Facebook is going to cut across party lines and just reach a much larger portion of the population, young and old. And so I think reach is a big difference. The second is global scale. If you think of, let's say I see a message on Facebook, but then a bunch of friends and family see it in a bunch of other countries abroad, and they echo the same message, that's going to influence me even more. So I think the global scale element matters a lot. The third, and maybe this is the most important difference, is that every piece of information that you see on social media in the online world, and every ad that you might see that's paid for by a political party, can be individualized to your SSN based on your personal information and the history of your information. And so that makes the ability to persuade much, much stronger. Those are the three major points. One thing in response to you, Matt, is I would love to think that a Twitter is allowing you to purchase a blue check, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, and not sell out your data, but I'm sure that they're doing it nonetheless. Pretty sure Verizon's doing it too. So I think a major problem that we have with respect to that is just how it's also invisible, and we don't, as consumers, see what is happening from a privacy or data perspective and what the true cost of the product is.
All right. Cory, I want to turn to you. So in a prep conversation that we had last week for this panel, Matt summarized the problem like this. Social networks made us all want to kill each other, okay? So you have a list of remedies that you propose, some of them around the interoperability, to break the power and the choke points of social networks. So when you hear how Matt and Dina describe the way that now communication works with the incentives of advertising and so on, do you think that your remedies that we hope that will bring more competition will create a different and less polarizing and higher quality information ecosystem?
So Chad made a really interesting point this morning where he said that the thing that drives superior technology to the fore is when switching costs are low and people can move from one platform to another. And that general purpose technologies, moreover, are the source of enormous foment and wealth and progress. And I think that to understand these remedies, you have to understand the relationship that they have to those two principles. So I agree, right? I'm a pretend computer scientist. I have an honorary degree in it. And in computer science, we know that there's only one kind of computer we know how to make. It's the general purpose computer that can run every program we know how to write. You can't make a computer that can run some programs and not others. This is why your printer can get a virus, right? Because we don't know how to make a printer that just prints. It can also get viruses. What that means is that you can always make an interoperable product or technology that unlocks whatever it is keeping people shackled to a platform. Like if you're stuck on MySpace, as everyone was when Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook, and as Dina reminds us in her absolutely magisterial paper, pitched MySpace users as the privacy-forward alternative to that service the crapulent Australian billionaire owned, where we will never mine your data. The way that they were able to solve the collective action problem of everyone you love is hanging out on MySpace so you can go be in the better Facebook alone is they gave you a bot, a scraper, right? You gave it your login credentials, it went to MySpace, it scraped all the messages waiting for you, put them in your Facebook inbox, let you reply to them, push them back out. No collective action problem, right? Low switching costs. Now, what all of the firms that benefited from this, Apple, who made iWork and cloned the Microsoft file formats, Microsoft, who made lots of their own clones and compatibility layers and things to embrace and extend and so on. What they've all done is they've gone up the ladder and kicked it away, right? Every pirate wants to be an admiral. And so today, they use a combination of anti-circumvention law, patents and copyrights, tortious interference theories, and so on, to create this thicket that you could think of as like felony contempt of business model, right? Where it becomes illegal to build the technologies that they themselves once built to enable these switching costs. So to get to like how this lock-in happens and how the extraction happens and what you can do about it, you have to understand that this is the lay of the land as we have it today. So the platforms, on the one hand, benefit from not having any competitors. Apple buys more companies than you and I buy groceries. Mark Zuckerberg wakes up in the middle of the night and sends an email to his CFO saying we should buy Instagram. It is better to buy than to compete. Right? We know why there's no alternatives. That's not sectoral specific. Everyone's in this problem. We all know that. But then there's like this digital stuff. And the first thing is that they can alter the rules on the back end really quickly. Right? They can twiddle the knobs. So they can change whether your stuff reaches someone else. They can change whether you can put a Mastodon link in your bio. They can change what you see and what you don't see, right? They've just got this endless twiddling. They've got these knobs, and they can't keep their fingers off their knobs, right? So to remedy that, we constrain their twiddling. We have privacy laws that restrict how they can use your data. We have laws that mandate interoperability or prohibit blocks on interoperability. We can create laws that require them to deliver messages from willing senders to willing receivers. Maybe they're not laws, maybe they're policies, maybe they're remedies, because none of these guys are going to want to go through 12 years in antitrust hell like AT&T did. When they cry uncle, maybe we say to them, all right, here's your remedy. You're going to have to deliver all the messages from people who sent them to the people who received them, provided they have a mutual relationship, and you can't extract Danegeld. So that's part one, right? We restrain their twiddling. The other thing we do is we restore user twiddling. Right? Ad blocking is the largest consumer boycott in the history of the world. If you try to ad block on an app, you have to reverse engineer. To do that, you violate Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. That's a felony punishable by a 5-year prison sentence and a $500,000 fine. Why are app ads terrible? Well, because there's no countervailing force. You can't make a counteroffer. I'm not going to see any ads because your ads were too obnoxious. Right? So we could restore some defense in law for reverse engineering, for bots, for scraping, for all these other things, and cabinet not by whether a firm says we shouldn't do it, because to Matt's point, even if you're paying for the product, you're still the product. Like Apple blocked all of Facebook's tracking and then secretly went ahead and did all the same tracking for itself. Right? Firms are not reliable proxies for their users' interests. You are the product to the extent the firm can treat you like the product. So we restore self-help remedies. We deputize new market entrants, cooperatives, individuals to represent users and give them tools that allow them to modify how the services work. And rather than saying to Apple, Facebook, or another large firm, you get to decide when someone's gone too far, we say you've gone too far because you violated a democratically accountable privacy law or a democratically accountable consumer protection statute. So rather than relying on these people to be constitutional monarchs who wisely represent the interests of the peons in their digital fields, we ask our democratic leaders to put limits on everyone's conduct, new market entrants and incumbents alike. So those are the sets of remedies. And do I think it'd make a better media environment? Yeah, because I think the media environment is not, that the bad media environment is downstream of the bad stuff, right? Like, why don't people trust the FDA? Well, maybe because the FDA slept on the opioid epidemic and said that they were safe and went ahead and said everyone should take opioids. I got chronic pain. I saw a doctor 10 years ago who told me to take opioids every day for the rest of my life. I did my own research because I'm an opioid denier, and I decided I shouldn't take opioids for the rest of my life. Now, if you ask me epistemologically, as someone with no background in virology, cell biology, or vaccine science, why I trust them on vaccines but not on opioids, I couldn't tell you. I mean, I got 5 jabs, but honestly, the epistemological basis for not believing in vaccines is exactly the same as the epistemological basis for not trusting your doctor when he says take opioids for the rest of your life, namely that the regulators are in collusion with a highly concentrated industry that doesn't care who they kill, provided they make a lot of money.
Cory, you certainly covered a lot of ground. Okay, Roslyn, I want to go back to your comment.
I had prepared the slides for this.
Go ahead.
Is
go
that
ahead.
okay to?
Yeah.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Do it?
Mm.
So I just first want to start to say thank you to Stiegler and to Guy to put the presentation together and, to give a little provocation after lunch. I hope I can help a little bit with that. I know we've covered a lot of things already, but I do have a very simple data slide I want to show to help put some of these things in perspective. And when we talk about social media concentration, of course, the owners, as you will, but I think there's a couple issues we need to think about: conglomerates versus pure plays. We've got to think about private versus government ownership. Those who are interested in this topic, I suggest you look at Elie Noam. He's been working on this decades. He's got teams around the world who are measuring concentration in the world's media. In my own case, my own PhD, following in the inspiration of Stiegler, I spent 5 years studying the impact of net neutrality rules across 53 countries and measuring different, what was the before and after of the imposition of rules, and found that countries versus hard rules, soft rules, and no rules, interestingly enough, the countries with the hardest net neutrality rules have had the least amount of local content development, and the countries with soft rules actually had a good outcome. And then, interestingly enough, countries with no rules, like China, have been the only ones would have been delivering competitors to America's largest tech companies. So if we talk about TikTok and Tencent and so on. So a lot of our theories of innovation and of kind of really being challenged in this environment. But I do want to share, I think there's some important global developments going on that could possibly be some consumer welfare and apologies to Eleanor, who I think was saying we don't have consumer welfare, but maybe these are pseudo consumer welfare actions that are being proposed in Congress now, in Korean legislature, in the European Union, in the European Commission. So just in a very simple way, I did my PhD in data science. It was involved with looking at analytics platforms and measuring rankings of different apps, revenue, downloads, and so on. It's very simple analysis, but a couple of things will just jump out. And thanks to I think it was Martin this morning, he was talking about BlackRock and Vanguard, again, also own the major positions in the largest US tech companies, so I think that adds another layer. But one of the thing that sticks out to me, which I saw in the data in 2016, was the rise of Chinese platforms. And if you look at today, if you look at TikTok, world's most visited domain, these are owned somewhat by Chinese companies and Chinese government. We don't really have good transparency to who owns these. And we have essentially US government has no oversight to that. Whatever acquisitions they're doing and those apps are being deployed in the US, really no oversight at all. And these are some of the fastest growing platforms in the US today. What about the whole issues there, which I think we've not been able to deal with at all? And then in the same vein, we were talking about Elon Musk. If I could just say one thing on his defense, that in the sense Twitter is a pure play, Pinterest, Snapchat, Telegram, these are still those kinds of garage style, those archetypal startups, that are they're just a one-off app, if you will, versus like WhatsApp is, or let's say YouTube, it's one of 200 apps in the Google universe. It's a very different thing. So interestingly enough, even though we have more networks, we have more bandwidth, more users, the world of what we go to is increasingly concentrated. So we have a 99.1 rule in internet traffic. You know, we're all kind of going to fewer and fewer destinations because the apps are living on one particular platform. But now with the exception of the Chinese apps coming into the picture. So, you know, interestingly enough, we'll look at like a Pony Ma, owner of Tencent. I mean, Tencent is something that we would never be able to do in USA. Essentially, there's Twitter with an Amazon attached to it and a Google and all the things all around one communication platform. We probably couldn't, no one has had thought to do that in the US. It is an even larger entity than anything that we can think of in the United States, and it's perfectly legitimate in China, and it's promoted by the Chinese government. So, you know, I just mentioned this guy, Sue Kim. You know, whatever you think about him, he's just trying to follow the rules and, you know, take over these 60 stations. Can't happen because of, let's say, atavistic rules in our particular system. So, you know, it's you know, just something to think about. Worldwide, there are now sort of the externalities that we're looking at with big tech, and I think Cory makes a great point about the kind of garbage or the traffic. And we can see 80% of the internet traffic, it's entertainment, it's movies. And talk about ad blockers, 25% of the data coming over our mobile phones is advertising. We're paying for a mobile subscription, 25% of the data is advertising. Like, that's totally wrong. The advertising should be subsidizing our mobile subscription, and yet we've not evolved our policy to allow that to happen. So the point here that, you know, I sort of want to leave with you is that we have additional problems now. Even with high-speed networks, we still have digital divides. We have 14 million Americans on the Affordable Connectivity Program because of you know, inability to afford broadband, and we need broadband at the same time because of the upward mobility, because of the social benefit services. So even if you take a fiber-to-the-home network, and I've studied 50 of them across the USA, that they are now being challenged to get the social benefit apps and services on those networks because of the explosion of the garbage or the entertainment. And that's something that governments are now increasingly concerned about. And what I want to suggest to you that has now been reintroduced in the Senate, it's the FAIR Act, Funding Affordable Internet with Reliable Contributions Act. FAIR Act. This is an idea to bring big tech companies into the Universal Service Fund. So we can have a sustainable, if you look at, we have a program to support broadband. How do we support rural hospitals, telehealth, and libraries, the poor to get broadband and so on? I'm not optimistic that our antitrust efforts are going to work to create market entry, that it's going to tame big tech. Certainly hasn't worked in the European Union. But what we can at least do is to recover funds from the tech companies and distribute them to the social programs and the social benefit programs that we support or we believe in. So this is something that's on the table, could bring, you know, many billions of dollars a year, support our various existing programs. Instead of today, you pay for universal service through your mobile bill, through your telephone, and this could actually instead be borne on the tech companies. And just to say, this is also a challenge in the European Union. We have 300 billion euro shortfall in networks because of this inability to recover the revenue from tech companies. And the regulatory efforts taken on in the European Union. Today, you know, 10 years ago when I started my studies, there were several European tech companies in the top 20. There are none today. And European Union overall only accounts for 1 to 2% of the world's total internet market value. And that later this year, Africa is going to surpass the European Union in internet market value. So I think the takeaway here is the regulatory efforts adopted in the European Union to promote the digital market, they haven't worked to create new European internet enterprises. And so this is a concern. South Korea has looked at this. They're one country that actually does create platforms that compete with big tech, and there they actually force the 5 largest companies to negotiate with the ISPs to make sure that the costs are recovered. And the benefit there in that case is that you've got highest level of broadband adoption of next generation networks, both in wireless and wireline. So, and you also have a high degree of export of Korean content. It's a major export. It's the world's 7th largest content economy. So there's something to be learned there. South Korea typically takes a third way approach on these things. And I would just put this on your radar that this is an increasing issue. And failing that the antitrust efforts are not working to create market entry for new firms or create competition with big tech, that there could be ways to at least get some benefit back to the public, back to consumers, by having tech companies participate in the broadband ecosystem.
Thank you, Roslyn. So Roslyn showed us, comparison of the size and power of some of those big tech companies. So a quick question for the people that are interested specifically in antitrust on this panel. We bandled together in this conversation, and we use interchangeably Facebook, Twitter, and Google, but while Facebook and Google are 2 of the most profitable companies in the world, actually Twitter is a company that is basically on the verge of bankruptcy, and it's not clear what's going to be the business model going forward. So does this, perhaps let's hear first from Dina and then from Matt, this changes the fact that it's not that Twitter is not really a very profitable company or a company that actually loses money, changes the way that we should think about regulating it or thinking about the ownership of it and so on. Dina?
Gosh, that's a good question. It wouldn't really change or affect my thinking because when you think about sort of market and market structure, you're really thinking about it from the framework of, well, what do users use it for and what do they use interchangeably with it? So from that perspective, I'm not concerned that Twitter might be having money problems in the short term. And also just from a big tech perspective, these are problems that you generally just solve in different ways. I'm sure Elon can solve it efficiently if he wants to.
The only way that he found
checks,
to solve it is selling shares of Tesla so far.
Selling blue checks or, I don't know, I can think of a million different ways. I'm sure he has lots and lots of ideas and he's not concerned about it. But one of the reasons Twitter would necessarily be having problems from a money perspective is because it sells advertising and it sells its ad space on exchanges, and that market is monopolized by Google. And so any company that sells ads that doesn't own the plumbing in that exchange-traded market is having major issues making money selling ads.
Yeah, Matt, you want to chime in on that, Anat?
Yeah, I mean, so Mark Zuckerberg figured out how to be a social media company, convince the advertisers that it's really a good idea to advertise on Facebook. And, I hear that he may have exaggerated just how much value they get from that, but they paid him for the ads. And so he's profitable. Elon Musk managed to alienate some of the advertisers, so he's been less successful in being sort of a social media company, pure social media. Obviously, Google has a different business model because it's mostly search. And then, alongside the search, you get targeted ads, and that's the way they are able to be so dominant. And of course, they have YouTube on the side, which has its own kind of more social media-like recommender /ad business model. So, all of that is in the sort of how do you, get your stock price to go up? How do you generate, shareholder value in the usual way? I think what we are concerned with in this conference and in this panel is the way the power, however it manifests itself, which is market power or other power, is affecting the rest of us, and therefore, if there's a problem, what to do about it. So we had some ideas for policy, since we want to look in the future and all this. So let me just chime in there, which is something that came up also in this conference last year, which is really to be even more modest, to start more modestly than even was suggested before, in terms of asking our democratic institutions to do something about these platforms. And the first thing I would want them to do is to be less opaque about what they do and what people do see there, so that we're able to analyze and discuss, economists and others, what it is that they're actually doing to our society and to our democracies in terms of you know, what kind of information gets spread and how are we able to increase you know, any level of trust or any level of understanding of what's going on, so that we do increase you know, trustworthiness in this, so we can actually have a functioning, you know, society.
I want to bring in for a second, two remarks made by Dina and Anat that I think are connected. Dina, you mentioned that in Silicon Valley, in the West Coast where you reside, actually decision makers, industry leaders don't pay attention anymore to traditional media because you're not powerful anymore. Why should I listen to you? Why should I be able to let you shape agenda or norms or and so on? And Anat, from her experience, you know, writing very critically about the financial system and financial regulators. Initially, in her book 10 years ago, she started to be interested very much in the role that media played in the financial crisis, and now. Anat, we were talking yesterday, and I said that when you look now, and you're now rewriting your book, a new edition, and actually say that the ability to, from your experience when it comes to the financial industry, the ability of people to speak truth to power actually has eroded in the last 10 years. And the question is it, you know, what Dina is describing, why the power of media has eroded, and you are not saying that this is why you think this is one of the reasons why we have failing regulation has to do with this the dynamic. So the question is, what's happening? Is it just the business that news outlets don't have, like Matt says, a business model anymore? Or actually, what Anat, you mentioned Neil Postman amusing herself to death. For the better part of the last 200 or 300 years, we were mostly worried about free speech and how to ensure it. Now, with the rise of the digital platforms, we are in a world that suffers mostly from overloads of speech. And junk speech drowns quality speech. I always remind people, some very smart thinker when it comes to media and the usage of media by politicians, Steve Bannon, that famously said that in this era, the media strategy is that one should adopt is to flood the zone with junk. And by the way, he didn't use junk, but another word.
Barnyard epithet.
Sorry?
A barnyard epithet.
Yeah. Okay. So if this is really the situation, what can we do here if we have an information system that is flooded with junk, like Bannon said? How can you hold the powerful players to account? Dina?
I think we need a lot more transparency. The first thing that came to my mind when you asked that question is, I think literally people in the Bay Area would just say, well, they just don't get retweeted or liked very much, right? And you see, you know, how much Elon's tweets are liked or retweeted just from a count perspective, or any person that is conducting journalism that he respects. And the differential of power is astounding. Now, why does that happen on those platforms? We don't even know, because the algorithms that drive it are non-transparent. So I think as a starting point, transparency around the data that they're using, but also how these algorithms and amplification algorithms work would be a great starting point.
Guy, I
Yeah,
have a very
go ahead.
simple solution I think economists would appreciate, and it's called pricing. I mean, presently we have the status quo it's not the law, but the status quo is, when the users can't control necessarily the data they ask for, but the sort of presumed assumption is, you'll watch a Netflix movie, that can come into your broadband subscription and into your to your home, and that expands and that fills that particular connection. Presently, there's not necessarily an incentive to make Netflix make that more efficient, that stream. And part of what a pricing model would do, if the tech companies actually paid for the traffic that they send into networks, they would have more incentive to be more judicious or more efficient about the data that they send in. So for example, there's already about 30% of efficiency we could improve with the exploding data that we have today, because there's no price to force the tech companies to send less garbage, to have more, to have less, because there's no price there. We just pay our broadband subscription, and the tech companies have de facto a cartel, in my opinion, of a price of zero that they can send sending the traffic into the networks. If in fact there was better negotiation, because the companies that I study, a rural broadband, they have zero market power to negotiate with the tech companies for what gets sent into their networks. And there's a de facto agreement that you can't block what goes into the network. You have to have everything. That a price mechanism could actually stop a lot of the traffic that you don't want, or at least force the tech companies to be more efficient or more judicious about what they send.
Anyone want to
Yes.
respond to that
I want to
notion
respond to
of
that.
And I'd like to
price
hear
and
from you as
quality?
well.
Yeah.
I doubt that pricing will get rid of garbage. I mean, the Fox media, they wanted to have the garbage because that's what their audience wanted. So I don't know that any kind of charge would take care of that problem. I think the problem of junk media is just a clutter of our brains that makes it more challenging for us to sort out what's going on in the world. And that's a huge problem. So just how to, speaking truth to power, when we were thinking about for the upcoming new edition of the book, we basically came up with the challenge to society of giving truth more power. And that's really what our problem is why truth does not have power. It kind of has to compete with the garbage. And that's tough. So, but at least if we define the problem, we might come up with more solutions. And so I think, in fact, transparency is the start of that. And if we had more transparency on what goes on behind the scenes, we might exert a little more shaming, at least, on Fox and how they lied so willingly. That would help, but we were deprived of that. Money paid to get rid of that Tucker Carlson testimony.
So I would like to respectfully dispute the factual account of what Netflix does. Not that I'm a fan of Netflix, but I think it's wrong to say they don't pay for the data they send. They assuredly do. There is no such thing as a tech company that isn't paying millions and millions of dollars to send. When you say they're not paying for the data they send, what you mean is they're not paying for the data we request, right? They're paying to put it out at their end of the network. We're paying to receive it. We pay a flat rate. Now, we can quibble over whether that rate should be flat or not, but it is indisputable that the firms that transmit the data pay for the transmission. And so this, gives rise to this question, like, is there anyone who's calling out for a carrier that rather than giving you the bits that you want most, gives you the bits that are most favorable to its shareholders or its cash basis? Right? I'm skeptical of that claim. And places where we've tried it have not promoted diversity and quality in our media landscape. The Facebook Basics experiments all over the world, when Mozilla went and studied them because they had been partnered with them because they wanted to get the zero rating benefit, because they wanted to bridge the digital divide, found that instead, what happened was that when Facebook was able to use its access to the capital markets to exclude rivals by subsidizing its own products, that it made Facebook and its hand-chosen collection of sources synonymous with the internet for users, and that the major beneficiaries of it weren't the poorest people in countries where it was rolled out. Rather, it was professionals in the middle class who, when they were on the train using their mobile phone, would get the Facebook basics, and then when they were at the office or at home on their Wi-Fi, which was unmetered, would flip over to the normal service. I don't think that a regime that says firms with deeper pockets or more access to the capital markets get preferential access to you, irrespective of your preferences, is a regime that produces the media diversity and quality that we're looking for.
Okay, so I want to bring it, before we move to questions from the audience, I want to bring a couple of issues to the panel. So the first one is, Paul Romer wrote a couple of years ago a piece that actually says one of the best ways to perhaps deal with what we're talking here is to thinking about banning targeted advertising. And I believe our friend here, David Diane, probably was one of the first people to raise it many years ago. And the second thing that Paul Romer, you had a conversation with him about it, says about social networks and tech monopolies. He says, well, let's just start with making sure that Zuckerberg and Musk, the law applied to them, because he says basically the law in this country is not applied to the most powerful and rich people, and if we get that right, perhaps some of the problems that we're discussing here will be easier to solve. So do you agree, and do you have any thoughts on how do you remedy that? One, applying the laws to everyone, and two, banning targeted advertising. Who would like to pick? Yeah, Matt.
Ad tax with Paul Romer. And in fact, his proposal has got quite a bit of traction in the telecom world, looking at a way to reform the Universal Service Fund. And particularly because if you look at, let's say, Google and Facebook, there's not a financial relationship with the end user. If you tax those two firms, you would get enough money to cover your Universal Service Fund in perpetuity, and the costs would not come back on the end users. So, that has had a number of economists have looked at that, presented it to the FCC. There's been a report to Congress last year entertaining that model, and the FAIR Act would actually have the FCC study that one model and sort of talk about pros and cons. So I think that there's certainly it's worth looking at for sure.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. So one of the mergers that's happening that I think the FTC is considering is the Kroger-Albertson supermarket merger, which most people think of as are people going to be in the same region? Are they going to be able to shop they'd have multiple options for shopping, or are vendors going to have multiple options to sell their goods? But one of the strong rationales for the merger is they want to build a bigger advertising business. And if you, like Walmart's CEO has said that the advertising business that Walmart has engaged in is the highest margin thing they've ever been into. And Amazon has more ad revenue than the entire global newspaper industry. So what we've seen is, and I don't know if this is like what you would consider traditionally advertising, which would be brand exposure or direct response, or if it's paying for shelf space, so trade spend. They're kind of merging. And so one of the ways that I think about targeted advertising is that it's sort of a form of price discrimination. And something that the Clayton Act Section 3 that Shaul talked about, that applies to commodities. But the same rationale, the same sort of significant problems in consolidating power that Congress wanted to address in 1914, I think still applies today. So that's how I would think about, as we're seeing more and more targeted advertising. I forgot what your second question is, but I have something written down.
Rule of law.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, so I want to address a kind of basic assumption that I think is underpinning some of the conversations here, which is like the sad sack, nothing can happen. It's all going to be bad. Everything is run by the powerful. And I don't understand why people have that view. It seems bizarre to me because I've seen Congress has held more hearings on antitrust in the last 5 years than it probably did in the last 30. I'm seeing exciting antitrust cases, partly based on Dina's work, which, frankly, I resent. But you know, if the political system were totally locked down by powerful interests, like why would any of this be happening? And I think that's why I really believe that you know, obviously we're in a moment right now where laws are kind of suggestions for the powerful, which is a huge problem. This is something that CFPB director, when he was at the FTC, Rohit Chopra, said about consent decrees. But I think the reason for that is ideological. And there's been a 40 or 50 year left and right rejection of the idea of public institutions as legitimate entities that wield power. And that part of that is disbelieving in the rule of law itself, right? There's just an attack, a belief that the use of authority through government is illegitimate. And I think there's a profound sense of that among the citizenry, partly for reasons that Cory mentioned. You know, to make people respect the law, you have to make the law respectable. And the law is not respectable right now. So I don't think that, like, there is, obviously the powerful are you know, doing what they do, and it's a bad situation right now. But I'm also seeing this incredible learning, mass learning that's going on, where the judges are being confronted with these questions for the first time. And they're ruling badly, but they're being confronted by it. And all you can do is make the case, talk to more people about the notion of the rule of law, which I think everybody agrees with, right, left, center. We all talk about that as a binding principle. And that, so I'm not a pessimist about this. I just think we were in a really, really bad spot, and the relearning just takes time.
Okay, so let's talk about two bills that did go through in two countries, in Australia and then in Canada. I know some.
Guy, before the can I comment?
Yeah, sure. Quickly.
I just want to say I agree that the key and why you're seeing all the hearings about is because there was something that entered the public kind of perception of what's going on, and and that's where you see Congress beginning to respond, maybe. And the problem that I see in some of the areas that I know about, like banking, is that you can really get people super confused about what's going on, and in which case you will not get what you want because you will be successful in confusing them. So, you know, you wanted the law to be worthy of respect of people, and that's not the case because it's not worthy of respect. So what I know about is just the power of people to control the narrative and the public perception of what's going on, say in banking, and obviously I can go on that, but that's not the topic of this panel. But it's just where I learned the importance and why I am on this kind of panel as opposed to others, because I've learned how important that is. So I think the key is to make the public understand more where the rule of law fails us, and in which case we will have better rules of law, better laws, and better enforcement of the laws.
So Guy, before we move on, I'd like to talk about ad tech and specifically about banning ads and the distributional effect it would have. So the behavioral advertising industry, right, they spend billions of dollars, they collect these non-consensual dossiers on us, they inflict lots of harms that are incidental to the advertising industries. You have breaches, you have police and military access, the national security questions that Dina mentioned earlier, and so on. But in terms of the press, they shift power in a really important way, because historic advertising was contextual, right? It was you're doing a big spread on shoes, you talk to some shoe manufacturers to see if they'll run some shoe ads next to it. Media outlets know more about the context of the work that they're publishing than intermediaries. But ad tech intermediaries know more about your readers than you ever can. And so how do we get to a world where 51% of every ad dollar is being captured by the intermediary? It's because the intermediary kind of transformed the ad business into one in which they themselves always have the informational advantage. Now, the claim of these intermediaries is that this process is legitimate from a human rights perspective because we all opt in, because we all saw some, garbage novella of legalese that said by being dumb enough to use this service, we can come over to your house and punch your grandmother and wear your underwear and make long distance calls, and we clicked I agree, so now they can spy on us, right? What we know is that when we create genuine affirmative consent regimes, like Apple did, right, where they had the button, one button, no tracking except by Apple, which will track you from asshole to appetite. When they put that button up, 96% of the people clicked the don't track me button. The other 4% worked for Facebook or were confused, right? So we know that there is no legitimate basis for it. If we had a privacy law, if Europe would enforce its privacy laws, which would first require that Ireland have the rule of law and stop being a tax haven and sucking up to the tech companies. But if we had real privacy law and real privacy law enforcement that required consent before there was tracking, there would be zero behavioral ads displayed. Right? What we know is that in a fair head-to-head comparison in the literature, we see about a 5% difference. So behavioral ads perform about 5% better than contextual ads. That is completely erased if the number of behavioral ads that you can lawfully serve is zero. Right? And so if we restore contextual ads, maybe the total income to the ad tech industry drops by 5%. But the distributional efficiency would have advertisers spending 20% less, publishers making 20% more, and the corrupting power of the intermediary shattered. Right? And we would also not have these dossiers on our behavior being leaked to spies and spooks and stalkers and every form of scumbag and predator.
All right, thank you. So last question before we go to the Q&A with the audience is, what do you think are the results of the experiment done in Australia and now in Canada, forcing Facebook and Google to negotiate deals with the publishers? Was it a good initiative? This is just sharing the letting the newspapers share the rents with monopolies instead of dealing with the root cause, or this is a way to balance the playing field? Cory.
Well, I mean, this is an area where Matt and I disagree, and though we're friends, this is an area that we disagree about, and he and I have been having a vigorous discussion, Nima, about the factual basis for it. I'm going to talk about the Canadian context, because that's the one I'm more familiar with. I'm a Canadian, as you can tell by my accent. In Canada, this news bargaining code that has come in, as with other jurisdictions, as a prelude to the actual passage of the rule, you saw the largest media firms and the largest tech firms striking voluntary agreements. And there's a basis that we can call that a success, right? You dangle, you say, like, don't make me turn this car around. We're not going to Disneyland if you kids don't stop fighting. And the kids figure out how to solve the problem themselves. There's a reason to like that answer. But one of the things that we have to consider is that the firms that were able to strike these bargains early on were the largest firms, specifically the very largest one, Torstar, which is the largest media company in the country. And the striking of that bargain was accompanied by the mysterious discontinuation of their excellent Defanging Big Tech series, in which they had been doing excellent investigative material on it. So, there's always this question, right? When I lived in the UK, I worked on the BBC's charter renewal, and I'm a believer in public media. There's always this question, which has come back again, thanks to he who shall not be named, about the relationship of media to the state when it gets a state subsidy. And I think we should be asking the same question, the same question we ask about advertisers and the press, as we do about direct subsidies and grants from tech firms to the press. Canadaland, which is a small independent podcasting network in Canada that has broken some very big stories, nearly brought down the Prime Minister in a scandal involving a corrupt charity called We Charity. They have opted into this. They've said that they're going to go along with it, but they hate it. And they said they feel they have to because all of their competitors are going to get a subsidy from the tech platforms, and they can't. And they're worried about their ability to cover this. Jesse Brown, who's the proprietor of Canadaland, is very frank about this. And so I think that it's a mixed bag. The joke goes, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. It would be much better.
It's better with a Boston accent.
Yeah, or I was thinking Irish, but yeah. If you're gonna resolve this conflict, the best way to do it would be to eliminate the 51% ad tax, the 30% app tax, the ability to hold users to ransom, the behavioral ad marketplace that shifts power from publishers to intermediaries. And that is like a very distant second best are these antitrust exemptions that allow for this bargaining. And the second largest media company in Canada is Post Media, which is owned by American vulture capitalists who bought the press and merged all of its newsrooms and laid a bunch of people off and are now doing terrible far-right reporting, they're going to be the second largest recipient of this bargaining money, right? I'm just, you know, I can hold my nose and like it, if only to make Matt happy, but I don't like it because I think that, like, I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, but I don't want the, but I think it's okay for the perfect to be the enemy of the terrible. And I'm not convinced that this isn't the terrible.
Thank you. And Canadaland, I meant to say Canadaland, but I think I almost said Candyland. But anyway,
Which common mistake.
Okay. Well, that was I mean, I think there are serious problems with the news bargaining code, but it is starting from the premise of if you wanted to get there, you shouldn't start from here, right? Which is a less eloquent way of saying exactly what Cory did. The basic problem, so if you look at, there's a couple of ways to think about the problem of newspaper, of the death of the publishers due to the consolidation of ad revenue in big tech platforms. And one of them, I think most people would say that the acquisition by Google of DoubleClick in 2018 was, or 2007 was sort of the original sin. And that consolidated the ad intermediary market. And if you look at ad revenue, you can see that like online ad revenue was fine in the 90s, was going up in the 2000s, it was going to newspapers. And then in 2007, it like went off a cliff. And that's because of the financial crisis. And so newspaper publishers were thinking, well, this is a financial crisis problem. And it continued to go down as the financial crisis got worse. Sorry, the last financial crisis. I remember to specify that at this point. But it didn't come back up. It's not that advertising didn't come back up. It's just that advertising had been redirected to big tech firms, largely because Google controlled the plumbing. The software plumbing under the internet. And the reason that newspapers couldn't bargain for better terms with Google, or I say newspapers, but I mean publishers, is because you couldn't not accept access to their ad software and their ad system in general. Because if you didn't, they didn't care. Google doesn't need any one particular publisher. But every publisher needed Google at that point to get both distribution and ad revenue. And so they became a price taker, not just on ad pricing, but data and all sorts of other terms. Now, if it's not that Google didn't need the news. If all the newspapers and publishers had gotten together and said, or even a substantial number, and said, we want to bargain together for different terms, Google would have had to listen. But that would have been a violation of antitrust laws or anti-cartel laws. So Australia looks at this problem and started to do an investigation in 2017. And this was part of a digital markets or digital platform inquiry. That's exceptional. And they've done analysis of lots of different parts of digital platforms. And they noticed this bargaining asymmetry is a real problem. And there are other ways to look at it. So the antitrust case, which is largely because of Dina's work on ad tech, is another way to look at the problem. It's saying the consolidation into the hands of one or two entities of ad markets is leading to the degradation of publishing revenue, that 51 cents on the dollar. And breaking that up would be really helpful, right? You can do that with the America Act. You can do it with an antitrust case. There are other mechanisms to get there. The other way to do it, which isn't ideal, but is the idea behind the News Media Bargaining Code and then other legislation like the JCPA in the US, is to just temporarily remove antitrust liability for newspaper publishers that are trying to get together and bargain collectively. So basically allow newspapers to form co-ops and bargain with a consolidated intermediary on the other side. It's not ideal. There are significant problems with that. But what has happened since Australia effectively put a legal regime in place to facilitate that is that you've seen about $200 million of I guess they're Australian dollars, so that's about 140 million US dollars, or more has gone into lots and lots and lots of different Australian media outlets. 90% of journalists, places where 90% of journalists work. Apparently, it's hard to find someone to be an intern, a journalist intern in Australia because there are so many full-time jobs, right? Which is maybe not the best way to save your newspapers, to create this kind of revenue stream where it's coming from Google and Facebook, going to these newspapers because of all of these deals, and they're all voluntary because just the law existing has made it so that nobody needs to actually use the arbitration mechanisms that are built into the law. Google and Facebook decided to negotiate. But it is the only place in the world where we've seen a reversal of the death of newspapers. And so as Canada is exploring doing this law, and I think they're going to probably put something forward in June, that's what they're looking to. And Europe has a different regime. They've tried doing it through copyright, and it didn't work. Because the fundamental problem here is an asymmetry of power, and you can address it in different ways. The JCPA in the US is slightly different because of First Amendment concerns. It's also a sunset. It's a 6-year time limit. So the idea is, you're able to deal with ad tech through ad tech consolidation. But that's the only thing that's worked anywhere. So that's kind of why I'm into this model.
Okay, let's take a few questions from the audience. Let's start here with Benjamin. Mm-hmm.
Oh.
You're Benjamin? Okay.
I just want to note that the newspapers whose death we're mourning here today were largely terrible. They were dedicated to, making their communities happy. They did not offend their local political structures. They were dependent on local businesses and certainly never said anything bad about them. And I guess my question is, how sure are we that the current world is worse? I mean, we valorize those instances of speaking truth to power that happened from time to time in the olden days, but I would wager that there's more of that in the modern media environment than there ever was in the older one. Are you guys sure that you want to go back to something like that?
Yes.
I think you make a great point. And I think if you want to have a free market for media, there's going to be newspapers that die of their own accord because people don't want them. I think the concerns I've heard today is that we don't, I think many of the speakers on the panel don't feel that there's a fair chance, that there's larger forces that systematically disrupt their ability. Now, at the same time, we haven't talked about emergent media. There's a Politico guy here. Politico came out of nowhere. It is a garage newspaper that has become extremely successful. I think it's a fantastic story. So we've talked about a lot of the bad things, but there are many new emergent media. Perhaps they don't rise to the level of Google, but they're significant nonetheless. We also was chatting with before about all kinds of other organizations have become media in their own right, think tanks, nonprofit journalism, It doesn't, to us, it doesn't move the needle in terms of the capital markets, but nonetheless, you can see that people go to those things because they feel those media are credible, they subscribe to them. That wasn't so much what we were talking about, but your point is well taken.
I just want to, so the best study that I've seen on this is one that showed that when a newspaper goes bankrupt, that borrowing rates in the municipality that it covers go up. So there's just an anticipation by investors that there's either more corruption, more waste. There's just no eyes looking at the political figure. So even despite all of the conflicts of interest that you see in local newspapers, there still is an important monitoring effect.
I just want to say that our first moderator was from a nonprofit media, ProPublica, and there are some initiatives to just bring basic, minutes from the municipality or the school board or something like that, because otherwise we really have no local governance anywhere. So we do need that. I'm not sure it's from a for-profit media that depends on ads, but we have to figure out somehow how to get media for all governments everywhere.
Okay. Luigi, you had a question?
Okay.
Yeah, I think there is an elephant in the room nobody wants to talk about. Since Anat talked about conspiracy, the Sherman Act, I think that my reading, and I might be wrong, and I'm open to be wrong, but my reading of the Twitter file is that there is a pretty active conspiracy of the large social media to actually coordinate on who they shadow ban and who they don't, very often with the help of the government, and sometimes even with the help of some academia. So why are we not talking about this as a major issue? Because it's bad that Google or Facebook or Twitter individually have all this power, but if they conspire together, I actually don't understand why there is not an antitrust investigation, because agreeing on who to ban or shadow ban, if that's not some form of price fixing, I don't know what it is.
I just think that when you've got a sector of like 5 firms, that that kind of conspiracy kind of falls out automatically, right? Because the upper echelon of those firms are all going to be people who work their way up through the ranks on their own. They never even need to meet to collude. I mean, I think I read this in Tim's paper about the telecoms industry, that the long coziness of it was one of the reasons it was running circles around the tech industry in the 2000s. And you know, you have... So like my kind of example of this is Jean Leger, right, who is the un-CEO of T-Mobile. So he takes over T-Mobile and he says, like Reagan declaring himself not to be an insider, Jean Leger takes over and he says, I am not like any telco CEO. I merely have 15 years at Sprint, 10 years at AT&T, and I'm going to merge my company with another one. But we're not running it like those other guys. So, you know, again, this is like, the question is the conspiratorial nature or the convergence on policy at the platforms, is it a standalone phenomenon, or is it an inevitable epiphenomenon of the concentration, right? In other words, if Sheryl Sandberg goes from Google to Facebook, like maybe we can believe that like Google and Facebook really are the Montagues and the Capulets, and that she had this sort of love-struck secret romance with Facebook that she finally consummated. Or maybe they're like entirely indistinguishable in their outlook, because with 5 firms you just get a monoculture, and then that monoculture begets these choices. And so, yeah, we could try and impose conduct remedies, but I'll remind you of the slide we saw this morning that said that less than 1% of the enforcement actions are to enforce consent decrees. Or we can just make it harder for them to enact the harms themselves.
No, I understand, but if I understand correctly, in this case, we have evidence that they talk to each other. So in general, it's difficult to nail it because we don't have evidence. But now we have evidence.
Yeah.
Where is the antitrust here?
Can I?
And the government was coordinating those talks in a way.
I was just going to say...
So you are saying that
Luigi,
the antitrust is in cahoots with the Department of Defense?
No, it's this. It's that IBM outspent the DOJ every year for 12 years and still didn't run out of money. So that's why we can't punish them, right? Like, if we wanted to get there, we wouldn't start from here. The first problem was allowing them to amass a war chest that makes them too big to fail and too big to jail. And now what we have to do is figure out how to deprive them of that war chest so that we can do that stuff. But you know, how many people on the stage today have said, well, all we need is more budget for enforcers because we can't afford to go after these guys, right? Like, that's why.
I have I think it's an important question, and there's a lot of things that one must not say in sort of polite liberal company. And that's one of them, right? You can't bring up the Twitter files without like massive eye rolling. So everybody look at him and roll your eyes.
I'm used to that.
Yeah, no. I think there's a broad relearning of where justice in America lives, right? And my view is that justice lives in the marketplace. And the way we write rules for our society is centered on the marketplace. But that's not where people have been focused. That's not the locus of politics for our political establishment, and hasn't been for a long time. It's changing. We're learning. But when I look at the problem of the Twitter files, right, and the attempt to engage in social control through centralized platforms, I see a bunch of people in big tech, in the intelligence community, in various parts of government, in nonprofits, who are well-meaning. Some of them aren't, but you know, you get that everywhere, and are trying to deal with a centralized apparatus and a society that's kind of like tearing itself apart. And they aren't thinking about the centralization itself as a problem. They're thinking about the centralization as the solution. It's very similar to how the Democrats thought about Obamacare, where they were like, let's further consolidate and put a regulatory overlay. It's the same thing with Dodd-Frank. It's a philosophy that you consolidate power and put experts in charge to fix things, right? The people who are on the other side of the Twitter files, right? I just did this, like, as if it's not a thing. It is a thing. Why did I do a sarcastic air quotes? Like, it's a real thing, right? Real stories. The people on the other side are largely conservatives, Republicans, who I think, are making legitimate points about social control, but they're not sure they want a government, right? And so, okay, you have a network of nonprofits and big tech and intelligence agencies that are colluding for social control. How are you going to deal with that? And my view is you have antitrust enforcers who come in and take apart these networks, and you put public utility rules to make sure that you neutralize the power so that nobody can engage in that kind of control and manipulation and censorship. But you need a government to do that. You need an administrative state to do that. And I think that the critics right now have not thought through what that means. And they are aligned with people who are trying to undermine antitrust enforcement itself. So that's kind of like where we're in, and it's changing. They're learning. People are trying to sort of discuss this. But I think it's really healthy to talk about the Twitter files like it's a real thing, like it's a real problem, and to talk about how the marketplace and centralization in the marketplace facilitates that and what to do about it.
All right. Okay. So one last question, Dasha, please. Mm-hmm.
I actually have two quick questions. The first one is, we saw the split up of Alibaba in China. Is it possible to do the same in the US with Amazon or Google, and would it work and be effective? And the second one about interoperability, how realistic and practical is it? I can imagine streaming services become interoperable because they share similar content, they have similar interface, but social networks, they are totally different. They have different encryption methods, they sell different content, except for when Instagram is trying to be TikTok. And the main thing, most of tech giants, they are based in the US, but in Eastern Europe, Telegram is the most popular messaging app. In Japan, it's Viber. In China, WeChat. So does it mean that we should make social networks interoperable just within one country? And what does it mean for competition in other countries? Thanks.
Yeah, briefly on interop, and I'll note I have a book coming out from Verso in the autumn called The Internet Con about interop and interop remedies. Imagine that you are Mark Zuckerberg and you've woken up this morning to discover that Power Ventures is making an interoperable overlay to Facebook, right? So you walk out of your headquarters and to your left is a building full of lawyers and to your right is a building full of engineers. Now, if you go into the building full of engineers, you could say, block the interoperator, right? But he never goes into the building full of engineers. He goes into the building full of lawyers. And he says, sue the interoperator. And the reason for that is we only know how to make one kind of computer, the Turing-complete universal computer that can run every program we know how to write, which means that blocking interop is a fool's errand. For them to block interop, they have to design a system that has no errors that can be exploited by an interoperator. For an interoperator to interoperate with them, all they need to do is discover one error and exploit it. In fact, they can discover 20 of them and exploit them in sequence every time they're patched. They can create a completely unquantifiable risk for Facebook or any other large platform in that they will have to task a completely unknowable number of engineers to try to fight guerrilla warfare. What we've seen historically, when a firm commits to interop and when the rival is deprived of legal remedies, as happened with Apple when it cloned Microsoft's file formats and built iWork, is the belligerent gives up. Right? They sue for peace, which is why like every Office file you have now ends in X, DocX, XLSX, PPTX, because they're XML based. Because like the minute that iWork that Steve Jobs committed real money to iWork so that every time they changed the file format, Steve Jobs would ship an update. They just stopped changing it because it wasn't worth it. The benefits were exceeded by the costs. And once that happened, everyone jumped on board. So you're right, there's Viper, there's Telegram, whatever. They're all using XML, right? They're all using TCP/IP because the benefits that arise out of the network effects of having a single standard are once they reach a tipping point, are unstoppable.
Roslyn?
I know we're out of time, so I can take it one-on-one.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Great panel.